Welcome to the Shelburne Planning Commission on Thursday, February 8th. The first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. All in favor?
I would move for that.
Or move for it? Right, sorry.
That's okay.
I missed last time, I'm rusty. So moved by Dick.
Second.
Seconded by Andrew. All right. So all in favor? Yeah.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Okay, now moving on to approval of the minutes, and we have a couple of them. So starting with the minutes of January 11th. Any comments?
I had none.
I had one under, it's probably nitpicky, under number 7, the third paragraph, saying that the cost to produce a written version would be covered. I was thinking a printed version. I don't know if saying a written version is the common. Is it? And then on point 8. Yeah, the number 8. And on 9, the comments in the title.
Oh, yeah. Fingers are dyslexic, sorry.
I think your fingers are like mine. And then number 10, Halverson is an E, I think, right?
Yes.
It is, okay.
S-E-N.
Yes. So those are the only comments I had on that. I forget, we need a motion to approve that one, and then we'll move on to the next one. So motion to approve the minutes of January 11th?
Second.
Well, I would entertain a motion, I suppose.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You want to first it?
Yes. Motion to approve the minutes.
That's correct.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. All right, motion by Perry, seconded by Susanna. All in favor?
Aye.
I'm abstaining because I wasn't here.
Me too.
All right. And now we can move on to the minutes of January 25th. I was not, so I will abstain. I did have a comment, but it got answered later in the notes, so who need?
I don't think I had anything.
All right, so if there aren't any other comments, motion to approve the minutes from January 25th.
So moved.
Moved by Dig,
Second?
seconded by Kate. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
All right, minutes of January 25th approved. Next item is, are there any disclosures around any potential conflicts of interest? Anything on the agenda tonight? Seeing none. Next one is open to the public. Seeing none. So then, moving on to the zoning bylaw changes, there has been lots of discussion that I admittedly was not involved with. Are we in a position to jump right into the approval to move it?
I was going to just.
Or do you-
offer a couple
some comments?
If I could, and that is that the agenda may give you the impression that you would take them up in turn. I also included the draft motion and the reports, thinking that it would be a single motion that would address all of the changes. But that's just my recommendation. You could do them individually. I had mentioned in the staff report having some housekeeping, and I do have 2 housekeeping items which I can show to you that I would encourage you to consider folding into the agenda. One is very, very simple. It's essentially typos. Another one is a bit more complicated, but I'd be happy to go to the projector and show you through it.
Sure. Want to
Okay?
review those, and then the plan would be if there's no issues with the housekeeping agendas or housekeeping items and no issues with the.
Then I would hand out a revised draft motion.
And do them all 3.
And
Okay.
I would hand out a revised report, which I believe I have copies. I thought I have copies. Or I could certainly show it to you on the screen because I have prepared a draft, a revised version of the report that's required by statute.
Sure, yeah, that would be great.
And maybe just for the benefit of everyone at home, I'll touch on, if I can get the computer to come back to life. So the first topic that came up as a result of the request by the new owners of Quinniasca has to do with expanding the language in the nonconformity section. And after the discussion at the last meeting, I understand the proposal to be a tweaked version of what had been developed by Dave Marshall, as tweaked by my suggestion. And so it would be the addition of a number 2 in this section on nonconformities that says, in the rural district, a structure that is nonconforming by virtue of the structure extending into the front yard setback from the public highway, it may be expanded or extended if such expansion or extension does not get any closer to the public road than the existing structure, and except in no case shall the building footprint of the expansion exceed 25%. So you've said it can grow, can't get any closer to the road than what the building does already, and there's a cap on the size. That was the consensus for that topic. The next topic was for the Alderson property, which is at the tip of Shelburne Point, and the proposed, for the request, was addressed through a proposal that would modify the Lakeshore overlay district. And there would be 2 parts to that. There would be a new item in the list of permitted uses for something that we will call Lakeshore safety fence. And that Lakeshore safety fence located at least 10 feet from the top of the bank. And then adding a definition for Lakeshore safety fence. And I don't think I want to read it, but it is, as you have said, there's one place in what I have included in your packets where there's a bracket at the very end. I recall talking about how one way to change this would be to have the words "in each 8-foot section" added to the very end if there was some ambiguity. This was in response to one of Chris Roy's comments. Frankly, I don't think it's necessary, which is one of the reasons why I put it in the brackets. And the other reason why I didn't put it, or that I put it in the brackets, is because the minutes that you just approved don't recognize that. So as Mary Ann had it, she didn't catch it as part of the motion. I know it was discussed, I know that I mentioned as a possibility, but one thing that should be resolved is, do you want that? If you're reflecting your minutes, those words that are in the brackets should not be part of what you warn for public hearing.
And you don't think they're important?
I don't think they're necessary, frankly, but they were discussed.
It
So-
isn't,
It is in the minutes?
it is, Dean, I'm sorry to,
But it wasn't as part of the motion.
yeah, I mean,
Or nearly horizontal of any 8-foot section. So in each. Okay, so I take it back. I must have flipped it around in my head. So then leave it in. My apologies. I thought I had looked at it and I must have gotten my head turned around. So in that case, you will want the words that are in the brackets retained.
That's slightly different.
Well, in any 8-foot section, I would say
Of any or
in each, because the purpose of it was to measure within a section. Chris Roy somehow seemed to think that it would be gamed where someone would maintain that the lowest point and the highest point would be determined to be the measuring point, and it's not. But in any, it would suggest that you could. It's in each that you would run, you would not have the gaming, because
Right.
if there's a big slope in any 8-foot section, okay, that's gonna be different than if you had an 800-foot section. The difference is gonna be much higher. Okay, so those two that were discussed on at least 2 occasions previously. The housekeeping,
Before moving
Sure.
on, so keeping it, I mean, having the text as is with that in the brackets is fine?
well, we would not include the brackets. So if the motion is made to warn it for public hearing, the direction, there could be a part of it that just says, remove the brackets, and the brackets will come out.
Right, okay.
To be anal, do we need a hyphen?
If you would like something hyphenated in 8 foot,
Well, I mean, that's grammatically correct, right? 8-foot section.
yeah, I mean, the bylaw does have this convention of spelling, and,
Yeah,
whichever the
whatever you
the
get, whatever your
board's
standard
pleasure
is. Yeah.
would be how I would do it. I think the merits of the issue were pretty much hashed out.
I'm good with that.
The housekeeping change, part 1, there was a discovery of some problems. If you have a copy of the zoning handy, table 2 at the beginning of the document essentially attempts to summarize some of the information that's in the following sections, and there's one place where 15,000 is included in the table, and it should be 10,000 square feet per unit. And then it's, the number in the district is 10,000, and it's not an issue of us saying, oh, well, no, the number in the section should change to match the table. That's not how the table came after the sections. There's another place where the number in the table says greater than or equal to 15 feet, when really it should be greater than or equal to 20 feet. And there's a footnote, and I know this is really in the weeds, there are actually footnotes 3 and 4. It would clarify things if in footnote 4, which currently says, when a lot backs up to residential uses, rear yard setbacks shall be 100 feet. Well, it's actually a little bit more confusing than that. It's when a lot that does not front on Shelburne Road and backs up to a residential area, that's when the distance is 100 feet. But if a lot fronted on Shelburne Road and it backed up to a residential area, it wouldn't be 100 feet. So those are kind of,
And the text is accurate, it's the table that needs the clarification.
yeah.
All right.
Okay. So the next section, I think I wanted to walk through a little bit of a set of slides first. So, and if it gets noisy, we can close the door. The statutory authorities, so what is in law that says towns can have local regulations are found in Chapter 117 of Title 24. Title 24 is a section of the statute that has to do with a lot of municipal and county things. Chapter 117 of that says, among other things, that towns can have site plan regulations. And you find that in Section 4416. And it also says towns can have conditional use review, and that's in 4414.3. And the way it normally works is, okay, we've got a section of state law that says you can do something, and we typically find in the local regulations a corresponding section. So we have site plan authority, a site plan section. And then our regulation site plan is 1900. Conditional use authority, our conditional use section is 1910. Okay, that's the kind of conventional approach. Authority section, authority section. What are site plan and conditional use? Site plan review typically deals with things like landscaping, screening, lighting, parking, and circulation. So it's the kind of stuff that's looked at on the site. It's not so much a question of can you do this, it's will the parking, circulation, and lighting and screening make for an attractive site and safe site. It applies to everything except 1 and 2 family homes. And as part of site plan review, you cannot deny an application, but you can condition it. You can have restrictions. And like I said before, we do this in section 1900. And I know this is a long wind-up for what may seem anticlimactic, but I think it will help you understand. Conditional use is concerned with the area beyond the lot. And it's looking at the impacts on this something will have on community facilities and services. So will it demand a lot of water? Will it put a lot of waste into our wastewater plant? Will it have a lot of fire calls or ambulance calls and police calls and so on? It also involves looking at traffic impacts. And it's typically the case that in your zoning regulations, you say, you know, a single family house, that's not conditional use. But if someone wanted to have a fast food restaurant, let's say it was going to generate a lot of traffic, that might be called a conditional use because it's going to have more impact. So it's a subset of all the uses. A conditional use can be denied, or it can be something that's approved with restrictions. And like I said, we do this in 1910. One of the weird things about state law in site plan is the authority. I said a couple of slides before, it's typical for site plan to look at these things: landscaping, screening, lighting, parking. But if you look at the law and you read it, the authority for site plan is actually really broad. So if a town wanted to, it could do the landscaping, screening, lighting, parking, and circulation, like we do. But it could also incorporate traffic impacts on surfaces, and so on as part of site plan. So we kind of keep it simple by saying the landscaping, lighting, screening stuff, we deal with site plan. The conditional use stuff, we deal with conditional use. The amendment, this housekeeping amendment, proposes, it's a little bit like genealogy. It proposes to show that conditional use authority comes from 2 parts of the statute. It's intending to show that you can review conditional uses as a result of the conditional use authority as well as through the site plan authority. Okay, so it's kind of like the overlap is, or if you can do conditional use things down here and you can do site plan things, we normally think of them up here, but it's actually overlapping. You can pull over, or it's like a subset. If you were doing your family tree, you might want to look up and see who all of your ancestors are and who are all the people from which you descend. And what this housekeeping proposal is intended to do is to show that the authority for conditional use review comes from both places. There's a reason for it being proposed, and like I say, it's a bit like genealogy, and we want to show where we're from, because sometimes the legislature tinkers with the authority, and sometimes that tinkering has unintended consequences and can have the effect of removing from a municipal bylaw something that they have currently the authority to do. And in fact, because there are all these things you can do as part of site plan review, you do still have the authority to do. Did that sink in? Did that make sense? Is that if they were knocking out, or if you think of it as a stool, if you knocked out one of the legs that's conditional use, you still get to do conditional use if you derive it from site plan.
This is basically preventing the state from being able to take authority away from us.
Well, fundamentally, yeah. I think it helps the integrity of the regulations to show that the authority comes from both places, so if anything happens. So my illustration is something like this. Imagine that the legislature gets lobbied by the doggy daycare lobby. Now, right now, Shelburne's regulations, we have a conditional use section that regulates doggy daycares as a conditional use. So imagine that the legislature says, Chapter 117, this enabling authority says, towns, you cannot prohibit doggy daycares, and doggy daycares may be subject to site plan review. Okay? So some people would react and say, oh, we don't have the ability to regulate under conditional use anymore. All of this work that was done by the Shelburne Planning Commission several years ago to create a set of rules for doggy daycares as part of site plan, or rather as part of conditional use, it could be made moot. Well, it won't be made, in my view, it won't be made moot if you consider language that's pretty simple. That would look like what we'll show on the screen shortly. So again, this is in site plan, section 1900. At the very end of site plan, I think it would be possible to add a paragraph. Our understanding and recommendation is we will address this by having a paragraph added that says conditional use review as an element of site plan review. Land development subject to sections 1900 and 1910. 1900 is site plan, 1910 is conditional use. So land development that's already subject to site plan and conditional use as of whatever date this gets adopted. So if it's governed by the bylaws as a conditional use and as a site plan today, it will be subject to the requirements of 1910 by virtue of the authority that's found in the site plan section and in the conditional use section. And then it ends with, and conditional use requirements shall apply unless it's specifically exempted. So maybe sometime in the future, we would decide, because right now, doggy daycares and kennels are regulated together. So if there was an amendment that later said, you know, kennels are okay, we just want to regulate doggy daycares with conditional uses, or vice versa, and you explicitly took them out, well, then it would no longer be subject to conditional use. So that's what this housekeeping amendment is about. I'd be happy to try to answer questions.
Yeah, if I'm following that. I think I'm following that. But if site plan is separate from conditional use from say a developer perspective, is that as part of the process, you start with a site plan and then?
They're separate sections of the regulations, but realistically, it all happens in the same hearing. So when someone comes to the board, the Development Review Board, they're very often subject to both. So sometimes there are cases where something is subject to only site plan review, and the board only looks at site plan review. But there are many cases where something is subject to both site plan and conditional use. So when someone is doing a project that is subject to both, when the hearing is warned, it will have a designation. It'll have an, let's just say, since we do these based on the calendar, so SP 018 or 18-1. So it's a site plan, the first one in 2018, / conditional use 18-1. So they're actually warned together, and it all happens as part of a single event. So the developer doesn't really experience it as two things, they experience it as one.
Yeah, that would be my only concern, is that you'd have a developer in a situation where they go through a site plan and they think everything's cool, and then somehow things aren't.
Right, and that's part of the argument that led to the creation of the Development Review Board. Because back in the old days, the site plan task was done by the Planning Commission, and the conditional use was done by the Zoning Board, and you had duplicate hearings that covered the same project, that looked at some of the same issues with different sections of the regulations. And so some people said, wait a second, why go through twice? So now the Planning Commission doesn't do the development review, and the Development Review Board handles all of these things in a single event.
So the net result then in this case is effectively streamlining a bit.
It's
It's
essentially
well, it's streamlining. It's preventing being able to get nitpicky over a conditional use that was overridden by a,
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's really not affecting the applicant. It's really making sure that nothing happens inadvertently as a result of an amendment where work that's been done by the planning commission gets undone. Because as long as the legislature says the municipality has the authority to review something under site plan, it has the ability to apply conditional use. It's just that without these words, we don't want to get into a fight with somebody, and it really makes it clear that this is what's intended. If you didn't want, if people were happy to say that, well, if the legislature feels that they're wiser than the planning commission when it comes to what criteria should be applied to looking at a doggy daycare, if you think they're wiser, then don't put any language in, because you would want the effect to be that they've lopped off your doggy daycare conditional use stuff. But if you want this stuff to have effect, language like this would hopefully keep it in play.
No, I support it because it actually, I think it actually clarifies the intent of the regulations and what the town believes its jurisdiction, its municipal jurisdiction to be. So to me, it seems like an important clarification.
Yeah, and this is, again, a whole discussion that involves warning stuff for public hearing. You warn the public hearing and people say that's a stupid idea, and you don't have to advance it. But this is the purpose of tonight, is to get the mailings out and to get the ad placed because of the special notice requirements, and then get it rolling. But there's nothing that says it has to, or any part of these has to continue as they've been drafted. They can be modified. So speaking of modified, what I have done regarding the report is to modify the purpose. So purpose has been revised to show, has developed in response, developed the changes in response to requests inquiries made by property owners A and B, and per recommendations of staff, commission believes, blah, blah, blah. That second sentence did not change. And then the additional part, and this kind of, I think, picks up on the theme. It's adding a paragraph in the second, or rather third page. By clarifying statutory authority and correcting typographical errors, the proposal would improve the efficiency of development review process as well as support economic development that is in accordance with the land use section of this plan. So those are the changes that would need to be made as part of this. And I'm happy to, because I don't see it in my stack, but I'm happy to give people printed copies of these.
Does this doesn't have any direct relation to the two items that were, it's just a housekeeping addition.
It's, right, I had said at the last meeting that there were some housekeeping things, but they're not directly related. I mean, there are, the question always comes up, how many things do you try to put into a package when you warn a hearing? Because there is efficiency. Every time we have to do this, it's a bit of a headache. Now, we have two different parties that want specific things changed about the bylaw, and then you've come up with proposals, or you've seen language that you think is maybe gonna be okay. These other things I thought were relatively straightforward, the first one especially, the tables. But I'm in no way saying hold things up while you make decisions on form-based zoning, as an example, because that's just not gonna, that's gonna take a long time.
so first thing on the housekeeping items, are there any points of discussion or additional questions?
I like the idea of the clarifying all the documents. It makes it simpler to start with for the whole process, for the developer and staff.
So would there be any reason anybody sees to not include that as part of this warning?
No.
All right.
And so if you are edging towards the motion, so this is a slightly tweaked version.
was mostly curious about the, when you were talking about the purpose, there was an A and a B. Oh,
Well, the A and the B was in reference to the A was the Quiniasca, B was Halverson, C was the table, and D was the zoning authority.
and that was as it would show up
Oops, I'm sorry, here.
in the report.
Oops.
How long have these two issues been separate?
How long are these two issues?
The site plan versus conditional use
Well,
review?
they've,
Always?
yeah, so, the Shelburne zoning regulations have a format that's kind of classic, and by that I guess I simply mean it's old. A more modern bylaw, some would say, is what's called a uniform bylaw, where you combine subdivision and zoning, and you kind of blend it all together. You might get rid of a conditional use section in site plan and really just call them development review standards. But that's a 5 or 10 year goal, is to be in a place where we could actually do that. But we've had these sections going back easily to the 80s, if not mid-70s. We've had that structure. So the A, B, C, D is it's in reference to the paragraph where it lists them out. And if I skipped over this, I apologize. The changes may be summarized as follows. Addition of language to allows a nonconformity subject to conditional use review. So this is where it spells it out as A and B and C and D. And then it just makes clear where they came from.
Got it. Yeah, I was just looking at the purpose of the packet and I didn't see the A and the B from I'm with you. Okay. So, with that then, do we have a motion to warn the public hearing? Or do we? Do we?
You could entertain the motion to warn the public hearing, and if that motion is adopted, then at a month from now, you would have your hearing. I mean, tomorrow I'd set in motion the warning and the copying that has to go out to the surrounding communities and that
Right.
stuff.
So procedurally, though, it's basically the motion is to say this, and then.
Yeah,
all in
with
favor,
with the possible addition of the remove the brackets and insertion of the hyphen, if that's what you'd like. Whoever makes it.
Grammatically, it's missing in other places.
Yeah, it's like, yeah,
Consistency.
that day is.
We'll have to do an overhaul hyphen replacement. Is it really necessary to say remove the brackets?
Well, I understand that they'll be removed. It really is, I'll take them out even if you don't include them in the motion.
Be nice in a minute, so.
Right, fair. So that's the first one with removal. So we just say with discussed removal of the brackets at the end of 2110.nnn?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Anybody itching to read this, or
With the
if
additional
not, I'm
language?
happy to.
Yeah, go for it.
Did I give you a copy?
No, if you have a copy, that's
We do.
They're over here.
Yeah, we got a couple on the end here. All right. So, in this motion to warn a public hearing, I move to direct staff to warn a public hearing to be held on March 8th, 2018 regarding amendment of the zoning bylaw. The amendment, if enacted, would add language to allow as nonconformities subject to conditional use review, limited expansion of structures encroaching on front yard setback in the rural zoning district, caveat being removal of the brackets.
That's from the second one.
Later.
Oh, for crying out loud. You're right. My note went to the wrong spot. But all right, then I need to back up because this is just the definition of the lakeshore safety fence. Okay. Right. Okay. Can I mulligan?
Sure.
Excellent.
There was a second.
All right, so I move to direct staff to warn a public hearing to be held on March 8th, 2018 regarding amendment of the zoning bylaw. The amendment, if enacted, would add language to allow as nonconformity subject to conditional use review, limited expansion of structures encroaching on front yard setback in the rural zoning district. Add language to allow as a permitted use, subject to all other applicable requirements of the Lakeshore Overlay District, installation of lakeshore safety fence structures within 100-foot setback from the 102-foot elevation contour along Lake Champlain. Caveat being that the brackets included in the definition of lakeshore safety fence at the end indicating in each 8-foot section, those brackets would be removed. Add language cross-referencing statutory authority relating to site plan review and conditional use review, and correct typographical errors in Table 2.
Second.
All right, so motion by Jason, second by Dick. I move to approve the zoning change report prepared by staff. Huh? Oh. Do we what? All in favor?
Aye.
All right. I move to approve the zoning change report prepared by staff and dated February 8th, 2018, and direct staff to distribute said report and copies of the amendment proposal as required by statute.
Second.
Discussion.
Any discussion? All right. Do we, again?
Yes, second
Second.
Oh.
Second motion.
Oh, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Fantastic.
That's easier.
I was going to say, I feel like I complicated that a lot. All right. So now on to the comprehensive plan. So 2 sections, growth and development and housing. We start with growth and development. Do you want to, that was you, Perry? Yep. And
They
Dick?
could put comments in
Are we
and
going to continue with the mixed-use portion that you had recommended?
The mixed-use portion?
The part we didn't get to last meeting?
The form-based code stuff?
No, didn't we leave something out? I thought.
Comprehensive plan?
No, I thought last meeting we didn't quite get done. And didn't you leave a note to, I'm fine.
Form-based zoning was the piece we didn't get to last meeting.
Right. I thought there was a partial, no, let's just continue.
Yeah, I mean, we had talked
misinterpreted.
about housing and growth and development switched. So there was the discussion of housing last time, and the agenda has an opportunity to revisit it. And like I said in the memo, there are things about those 2 sections that intertie.
It is on the end, so.
Oh, okay. So, and I have up on the screen, Perry, the section, so if there's any benefit. And I also have paper copies of the, if people prefer to work in paper, I have a printed version of the edits Perry made yesterday afternoon, that I printed this morning, so I can hand those out if you'd like to mark that up. Yep.
yes, I'm good.
I'll take it.
So I didn't make a ton of changes. for me, it's much more a kind of question at the heart of growth, which is the state and the county give us numbers and they say, okay, here's what we anticipate your rate of growth being between now and 2050. And this is the number of people that we think are going to come in. Well, people aren't coming in if we don't have the housing for it. And so I wanted to think of it from the perspective of forget about that the town now has around 7,000 people. Look at it from the perspective of if we want 107 or 110 people to move to town on average between now and 2050, that's going to require anywhere from between 25 to 50 units of housing. So think of the Quiniasca development, which is around 90 units, which would be 2 years worth of housing based on this kind of growth rate. Do we want a new Quiniasca development, or does the town want and can it handle all the facilities, the schools, the sewers, the water, all those things? Can we handle that kind of development every 2 years? Do we want that? Because it's entirely okay to say, you know, we see the numbers that the state is providing us, but we are going to maintain the characteristics that has made Shelburne for 300 plus years. And it has grown a lot, and we're restricting growth to very specific areas. And we recognize that we are a commuter community outside of Burlington. But I'm not comfortable putting that we're going to grow 110 people per year as an average rate of growth, because that's what the state is having as their back of the envelope calculation.
Well, that was the 110 per year was, remember, that's the number that's from before. The updated numbers, and I think I did include in the packets, the forecasts for the upcoming.
It was something like 1.something%.
Yeah,
And I had it
right,
in
less
an
than
old pen.
5% over 5-year pieces, so it's less than a percentage point, yeah. So the 2015, 2010, 2015, but they're up on the wall.
So it really comes down to, and this is why it ties in with the housing section.
Same question I
Yeah.
asked.
How many houses do we want built per year? Because if you look at on Realtor.com today, in all of Shelburne, there are 24 total things listed for sale, 3 of which are multi-million-dollar pieces of land on Shelburne Point that nobody wants to buy and develop because you can't deduct your property taxes anymore.
Numbers are off 50 to 60% on average for the last 2 years. That's a declining number. Sales, just countywide.
Inventory?
Countywide inventory. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers were. The last time we met, there was 341 listings in Chittenden County. 3 years ago, we were carrying somewhere between 800 and 900. So it's, and condominiums are in the same category pretty much. But uniquely, the number of sales has continued along pretty much in the same line, which is causing the decline in inventory. And there's different theories about why it occurs. One of mine is that I think some people don't want to put their houses on the market because they're not sure they can get what they want if they're downsizing or it's such a tight market. That's possibly one increment. But
Even with the numbers adjusted, the point is valid. I mean, are we looking at modifying bylaws to increase density in various areas to support these things, and how aggressive do we want to be about that in order to support this demand? I mean, there is a finite amount of space if we're still saying that we're focusing on the growth areas as far as population goes.
I also like the idea of protecting residential areas and neighborhoods that are really comfortable, and, you know, rather than increasing density just to accommodate more housing, which may not be what the people in those communities want. They bought these homes, they like those properties. So I'm right with you, Barry.
Just one question back would be, what's the biggest gating factor? So like, is it sewer, is it schools, what would be put the biggest constraint on growth? So if we said, yeah, we want a Quiniesca every 2 years, like, what would preclude that from actually happening?
Stormwater and wastewater.
And just how difficult it is to get anything completed here in terms of like just the number of steps and the amount of time that it takes. I mean, that's why.
Not that, like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's slow, but I'm just saying, is there any constraint, some system that would say, we're at capacity, we can't add any more, even if there's burning desire to? Like, what would be the things that would hold things back?
Well, the water and the sewer.
So water availability, I mean, drinking water is abundant. And frankly, the people that operate Shelburne's water system would love to sell more water, and our rates are high because usage has gone down. But water availability is not normally a strong constraint in a climate like Vermont's. Wastewater, we have capacity in our plants. One of the things is there are unknowns about what the burden will be on the town in the future regarding the amount of pollution. We have to take out more and more waste from our waste. And if we have to do an upgrade, when we have to do an upgrade, it's going to be expensive. There are ideas floating around, and this is where, I gave that kind of quick introduction to Public Works, but if we really want to know the answers, we should go to Chris and Rick and the different Public Works people to get their, informed opinion on some of these things, like how many years growth do we have? And there are some studies out there. But wastewater is a bigger concern than water supply.
The water supply issue that's constraining this right now is there's the need to have a secondary supply,
Yeah,
right?
the
That's-
storage issue, which
Yeah.
in the scheme of things, it's, I don't think of it as being.
That's a
as-
solvable
It's
problem.
easily solved.
Yeah, I don't think of it as being like, well, what do we do if we can't, the ability to retrofit a wastewater treatment plant is a much bigger challenge than deciding where the storage is going to be and who's going to pay for it.
Or paying South Burlington for storage
Something
we're
like
supposed to
that.
be using,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm just asking because, if you're trying to say yay or nay, we do or do not want to grow that way, well, what would be the gating things that would preclude us from doing whether we wanted to, so just trying to understand.
Well, we can just, the town can make it very restrictive, where we say, we have all these areas that are rural areas that we're not growing on. And then we have the historic areas where we don't want to add to the density there because you're going to lose the character, of the town. It's why we don't have a 30-story skyscraper in the heart of Shelburne. And so it's balanced. So we could just make it really restrictive and say, well, we're trying to retain the character of the town, and if we become the size of South Burlington, it's no longer that kind of bucolic kind of country Vermont setting.
We do have a growth area that our goal is to put growth in that area, and for myself, I would like to see more apartments, maybe a hotel or two in the corridor. But
Right.
apartments, some sort of,
That is the one area where we really would like to see a lot more growth. And we have the capacity for growth. And, so I think one of the things we need to ask is, why is that not happening? And we created form-based regulations to try and make it easier. So I have some theories about why that's not happening. But that could be one way to look at it, that we're saying that maybe, I don't know what the right number is, and I don't even know if that's the right way to look at it, but there are places in the town that would be great to have some growth. So we're really, our concerns are about where the growth happens and the manner in which it happens. And so if it happens in certain places, we would welcome it. If it happens in other areas and in other ways, less so.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but The statistics show that we are an aging, I mean, Vermont is an aging state, but that Shelburne itself is an aging community. And therefore, the housing needs moving forward may be less four-bedroom homes and more, right.
A couple of things quickly about the demographics. Shelburne has had a older than average population for many years, and the reason for that is kind of unique to Shelburne because Shelburne's zoning regulations years ago were very, very favorable to the creation of elderly housing. And so what happened, and I'm not saying that that zoning resulted in the creation of Wake Robin. Wake Robin kind of happened on its own, but we have other housing for the elderly that I think was induced. So we have people who move here as elders.
As a consequence.
Which is not exactly the case in many other Vermont communities where the population grays. Now, the population is graying, but an additional factor in Shelburne is that we've had these places where people come in and they're pulling up the average because they're older when they come in.
Consistently elderly too, because they're elder structures.
Replaced, right.
Birth rates go down with education. Shelburne's population is highly educated. Household sizes have, gotten smaller and smaller, fewer kids. And so that's all the more reason why the average is going up.
And our school population is declining.
And there was a time 15 years ago when people were really concerned about the school population, and that started to evaporate about 10 years ago, and it hasn't been an issue as of late. So I don't think that if we, in addition to the water, sewer, wastewater, all these people that we would ask about what kinds of constraints on growth are there, if we talked to the school, the supervisory union, I don't believe they would see their facilities as a huge constraint either. We have, in terms of growth, we have an education impact fee, which is intended to collect from new growth money that is to pay their fair share for a new facility if it's built. So they're, in a way, paying more for their impact than someone who's moving into an existing house. Or if a family's there, parents move to Florida and their kids move in, who had to send kids to school, they're not paying towards that capacity. Although you could say that they paid for it years ago. I did want to just also say, in terms of the numbers in the plan, the 110 persons per year, that came about as a result of some projections that were done back in the 2000s. And, 110 per year is a lot if you compare it to the amount of growth that we actually had between 2000. So the 2000 population in Shelburne was 6,944, 7,144 in 2010. So 200 over 10 years, so 20 per year. Now, the population, when you get out of the census years, the estimates are dicey, but the number that was included in the RPC's forecasting is this 7,759. So that's 600 plus in Shelburne in 5 years, and so that's pretty substantial. But you have things like Harrington Village, you have some kind of atypical things, but you at least get, you get a number that is in the neighborhood of the 110, but for a variety of reasons, their forecasts, looking out beyond that, have us showing more modest growth. So I guess I would understand if some of the conversation is, wow, that old projection of 110 per year doesn't seem to mesh the projections for the future, which starting for the block between 2015 and 2020, the RPC's number is 58.
So would it be, hearing this, would it make sense to have, not this exact language, but the theme is that we should strive to provide housing to be in line with Shelburne's share of Chittenden County growth, while ensuring it doesn't outpace our infrastructure and services to support it? I mean, that's the general concept that we're going for. But I think to Perry's point and what the limiting factors may be, do we have or should we advocate for having some sort of triggers in place? I understand that new developments, there's the the education impact fee that can go towards increasing the amount of students that we could handle. But is there a growth to number of students forecast or trigger to say, all right, once we hit this mark, we need to start considering add-ons?
There is a set of projections, and unfortunately, I didn't think to load them on, and I don't think I can get them over the,
Or is that something that we could reference to say, as part of this section, to say this is, we want to be aware of our position within Chittenden County and make sure that we're consistent with growth and that we're supporting our share of the county, but at the same time, be mindful of these triggers and be aware of our limiting factors and don't just grow for the sake of growing.
I'm just saying, I wish that I have their forecast, and I wish I could give them to you so that you would see what kinds of changes they are seeing. And if their numbers are essentially flat, irrespective of these other forecasts, then, unless the trigger is existing number of students, we're not gonna, at least they believe they're not gonna reach a trigger.
The town does have the ability to, if we all of a sudden we got 2 or 3 Quiniaskis, we could have them phase, only allow a certain number of units per year to be built. And DRB, I believe, is the authority for that.
I mean, it does seem like for a town plan looking forward, this number's way too high.
It doesn't seem to be supported by
Yeah.
any numbers that we've got.
By
Yeah,
reality.
now,
Yeah.
so, I mean,
I mean, history and future projections all seem to indicate the number's
yeah.
a fifth of that or
The-
a quarter of that.
The only kind of unknown, and I think it's a remote factor in this, is the zoning in Shelburne optionally through form-based zoning is attractive. The form-based zoning that was adopted allows more growth, but if the last 2 years are any indication, it's not going to cause anything to spike because we haven't seen much activity so far. But the people were asking the question about, how much growth can the town have? Several years ago, when the zoning was not radically different, the build-out was, I believe, another 1,800 units. Another 1,800 units, so do 2.5 times that, add it to the existing population, and that was kind of the build-out population. It's anybody's guess what that number would be if the Shelburne Road corridor was all form-based zone developed, but it would be higher because there's more development potential. That's all the kind of theoretical, if we can wait 1,000 years and the zoning doesn't change. If we're talking about the next 20 or 30 years, looking down the road, we're not going to see big numbers unless some kind of unpredictable thing happens.
Would it be appropriate, I'm just trying to, we just don't seem to be getting anywhere. Would it be appropriate to talk about this, maybe using different metrics? And to talk about it in terms of what, sort of a vision of the pattern of development that we're looking for? Because 110 new persons per year on average is, to me, far more acceptable if it happens on Shelburne Road, versus, if it, happens somewhere. Well, the Quiniaska thing has been something that, I don't think too many people have been super thrilled about, for example. So,
Yeah, I think that's the
Yeah.
central conversation that the
Right.
commission needs to have is that,
So in the second paragraph, it talks about, this vision, and maybe we need to articulate what we mean by that, which we're not. We just talk about, to me, fostering future residential and non-residential development when considering the need for conservation of culture, history, and land, environmental stewardship, and successful integration of the town into a larger regional community just doesn't mean anything. Or it could mean anything. So,
yeah, I think this is one of those sections of
Yeah.
the plan that got changed. If you remember, when the commission had done work, it got to the select board, they did a lot of tinkering having to do with the vision and the growth outlook, and then it got incorporated here.
yeah.
So
So maybe we kind of reintroduce some notion of what we
But the
mean by
words,
this.
this vision, are, I think, meant to refer to that preceding paragraph, which says what it says.
Okay.
I guess what I was trying to get across by bringing everyone's attention to the actual number and this rate of growth is we're representatives of the town and kind of like, what do people want from the community? Do they want it to be the size of a South Burlington? It's okay to remain in this kind of realm of 7,000 people. We don't need to grow for the sake of growing. If we have if the demographics are good, and as we keep talking about that we have Wake Robins and we have these elder care facilities with baby boomers retiring and aging out, that they're going to continue to be coming in and paying tons of dough into the community, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And when we looked at the housing presentation, it showed that our housing, the cost of our houses are significantly higher than the average in Chittenden County and the state at large. So we have a healthy tax base. And so the question is, are we able to support all of the facilities with our tax base and with the adults and children that are going through the town at this number? It doesn't need to double or triple in size. We don't need to grow because the town is dying. The town is doing very well. And that's in part because of our proximity to the hospital, which is the #1 employer in the state, and the university, which is one of the top employers in the state. So it's entirely okay to say, we're not putting a number on this. We're comfortable with where we are. We will grow if the opportunity presents itself to grow. But we don't need to just be beholden to, we're going to shoot for some ridiculous number, whether it's high, low, or whatever, because 35 years down the road from now, you can't forecast that.
Well, ultimately, isn't it driven by market forces, though? I mean, I'm thinking of it less in terms of numbers, because we could say, like, let's say it's not even 110, let's say it's 20. We could say that we want to grow by 20 people per year, but that's not going to happen every year exactly. It's going to be driven by market forces on what developers are going to build based on what demand is going to pay for. And so I think the rest of what we're doing is guiding towards building in the growth areas. We're looking at solutions in the rural areas, recognizing that growth is coming, but then having triggers put in place, understanding what those limiting factors are, and having triggers in place to say, at this certain level of population or this number of kids or whatever the forecast models are that the town has, then that would trigger additional work to building out our infrastructure. So it would be less tied to a specific number that, hey, we're trying to maintain this growth rate. It's more, let it happen. I mean, if we said that we want growth to happen in the growth area and a developer comes in and says, hey, I have this huge comprehensive plan that can bring in 500 units and it's going to fit within the models that we have and it builds out the way that we'd like that to work, then is that a bad thing?
No, what we should do is have an idea of what we'd like him to come in with. Apartments for young people. We could use that to support our businesses. Flats for folks who don't want to leave Shelburne but want to sell their houses. Probably some condos. A hotel would be nice. They're building hotels. They just came out the other day with 2 proposed hotels in Williston. I don't see why Williston would be any more attractive to someone looking for a hotel than Shelburne.
So, I'm just wondering.
I'm just wondering how you target those.
If the number 110 was based on a projection from sometime in the 2000s, and we have a set of projections, and when we look at that projection, and if we look for the projection period between 2015 and 2020, it's 58 a year, and if we look at 2020 to 2025, it's 46. So the average of that is 52. I mean, if the basis for the projection last time was, if the basis for the number was a projection that said 110, and if we look at these and the average effectively is 52, would you be thinking about using a number like 52 because that's essentially what the new projection says?
My argument is, how important is that number?
It's funny, there's been a history of having this kind of number in the Shelburne plan going back into the 90s.
Started when
Fred
that
Sch-
number wasn't so high. There was a lot of growth going on when we established a number.
Yeah. I mean,
So it was to contain growth, it
it
wasn't
used to be a
target.
percentage, or at least at one point in the late 90s, it was a percentage. And it was in terms of people didn't want the town to grow by more than, and I think it was like 1% or 1 point something percent, because there was concern about growth. In the latest iteration of the plan, the board that approved it didn't want the number to present that way. It wasn't seen as a cap or something that's a lid holding things back. They did not want the number to be interpreted that way, so it doesn't read quite that way. Doesn't mean that it couldn't go back to the way it was in the 90s. I'm just trying to get some sense of what's the center, what's the number? If you didn't do anything, what's the number?
I don't think it's a number. I think there's very specific things that like Dick and Jason are saying that we, as a town, would like to have in very specific areas and very specific uses. But like
don't wanna know.
single family homes on quarter acre plots of land in rows, all along Dorset Street, where there's hay bales right now, is not what people want.
And I think that's where I'm coming
Yeah.
from, is that if we're directing growth into the growth areas and we have things like form-based zonings that has mixed use and incorporates residential, this is mostly just devil's advocate, would it matter if a developer came in and said, okay, Route 7 corridor, I have this master plan and I'm gonna bring in all of this housing and mixed use and it's gonna be this amazing thing? If the demand is there to fill those spaces, then the next question would be, do we have the infrastructure to support all this? And then that gets into, do we have things like that education impact fee, and how are they supporting the expansion, not expansion, but the upgrade of sewer systems and that sort of thing? Would that be bad? Which gets back to Perry's original point of, do we want to grow for the sake of growth, or does the town feel more like, well, no, we like it the way it is, we don't necessarily want to grow more, let's grow within what we have? And I personally think the common ground is that we're focusing where we want growth to be. The question to us should be, do we want to limit that or not? Because if we don't limit it, then market forces would play their course, I would assume.
Do you want to limit that? You mean
Like
change
limit
the
growth.
densities?
So
Or
if somebody came in and said, okay, we've got this plan to develop and it's going to result in 500 housing units, apartments, or whatever they might be, then to your point, okay, we see that, but based on these triggers we have, that's going to overload some systems, so we'd want to phase this in over X number of years.
Right.
And then that's where that discussion would take place.
And that's typically how a number like this gets used, is that people will say, hey, that's going to exceed the average. There's no way, you're nowhere close. So therefore, you shall phase. Your project will be approved, but you're going to have to phase it over 10 years or something like that. And they'll cite the number. People who are speaking about the project will cite the number as a basis for the DRB or someone controlling how quickly the project builds out.
And it doesn't have to be based on that. It could be determined by, well, for instance, when we put the elderly project in across the road, we didn't phase that project because there were almost no children involved there. There were
When you say
80,
Woodson Road, are you talking about Boulder Hill?
no, right over here, behind the Methodist Church. Oh,
Oh,
beside,
Harrington.
Harrington?
right, we didn't phase there because there was a limited number of family homes, was it 24 or something like that? And 80 senior
That's
housing projects.
35 affordable elderly. and-
So if you had someone come in with a project such as what you're talking about, and it was mostly apartments where there wouldn't be a lot of children, I don't think the town would allow them to put 500 units up, but you couldn't build it that fast anyway.
Oh, right, that was mostly just an extreme
But
example.
typically, a planned project like that, I think, probably would be welcome. It would be answering what we're trying to do. It would bring money to the town.
Particularly in that sort of hamlet-like structure we were talking about last week, if it's complies with, you know, if I could choose that over empty storefronts on Route 7, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm thinking of multi-family buildings where you can put nice apartments.
With a deli in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How about
bring it
this
on.
as a sort of jumping off point? So we keep the first paragraph for now, and then we start the second paragraph with a sentence that says something like, you know, Shelburne seeks to retain its rural character in areas not designated for growth. So I think we can all, I think, agree that that is something we've been supporting and discussing for months now. And then we can start to talk about, that gets us into being able to talk about, well, you know, how we achieve that, and that would be putting the growth where we want it to go, and what are those places, and we start to talk about that. So the number is not the scary thing anymore. It's really, it's the built outcome that is, that we're shaping and we're discussing. Because we can't control what's coming our way. We don't really know. I mean, you know, one of the things that I'm increasingly thinking about are, I think we're going to start to get climate refugees coming even to Vermont, you know, because of, you know, the changes that are happening, you know, with running out of water and too much water. And, you know, the one place that seems pretty stable is, you know, the Northeast and the upper Midwest. So I think over time, there's going to be a lot of trends that maybe are unanticipated today. So, so anyway, so I guess personally, I would like to have a sense of where we feel we can accommodate growth, whether it, you know, materializes or not, because I think at some point it will start to, but I don't think we can control the rate at which it happens. I just don't think that's realistic. So what do you guys think of that as just sort of a way to start with this? Because I think these numbers are just meaningless to me. I mean, but I think we all have a pretty good idea of that we want to direct the growth in certain sort of broad patterns, and we're kind of coming to a consensus about what those are.
I think the plan has to have some piece of data or numbers just underlying that. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think you have to deal with both. I think you have to bring that number way further down, closer to 50-something, just saying this is what people have forecasted. We're anticipating something like this so that we know kind of what we're expecting. And then you build on that and say, as that growth happens, we would like it directed in these ways.
It bears reminding you that the plan has the land use section, the where will the growth happen, in essentially the section that answers the question of how should you grow and where should you grow. That's, if you read the document from beginning to end, you would have hit that first. So the question about where you will grow, you know, and you do need to loop back to talk about future land use, but I just want to remind people that question is addressed centrally there. Don't forget it. I mean, you can cross-reference, but I just want everybody to remember, yeah, how do you grow, where will you grow? You do talk about that in future land use.
That's where I think the commission has the role, is to say, well, growth is going to happen over time. The county's growing, the town should grow with the county, but it's our work should be guiding that growth into the areas where we want growth to happen and the parameters that go with it. I mean, the numbers, I'm with you, Kate. The numbers are, I think to your point, it's helpful to have numbers in there. Like there's something just as a loose rule of thumb, and maybe that's, I'm not a developer.
It gives it a skeleton or a structure.
Well, can we talk about the form that we want first, the outcomes that we want, and then sort of plug the numbers in, like, well, and then talk about, well, how would we achieve that? You know, if it happens, 2,000 people show up all at once, that's not going to work.
That's what I was saying. For the purpose of this specific document, we're guiding in terms of where we want growth to happen, and we're continuously working on that. So as far as what the specific numbers are, my initial comment was, do we just want to indicate that we want to stay in line with our share of Chittenden County from a growth perspective? Like, that's our target, but we're not saying that we have to hit it. It doesn't have to be exact every year. It's not a hard number.
So our goal is sustainability.
Right.
We want to build that area so that it makes business strong, restaurants strong. We can bring in hotels. Our goal is sustainability. At some point in time, growth will taper off. Effectively. Maybe it won't. I don't know. Maybe I won't be here. But
And I don't want to see empty storefronts either. Yeah.
no.
Sorry, but I
No, I just wanted to kind of like provide a slightly different perspective, and that's about the interpretation of these numbers can be made more meaningful if we kind of like assess the overall capacity of the houses under a given form. So for example, you have like a commercial area designated in a land use projections, and you have like high density like corridors in rural areas designated. So then you can do like an exercise where you can calculate under that form-based designated zones, what is the maximum capacity of the houses, and you can assign like per capita, like per household, like number of people on average, and then calculate like what is your maximum capacity under that form-based approach to calculate, and then compare these numbers, growth projections, to see what fraction of the capacity you're operating under that scenario. Versus, like, say, if you have a different form-based zoning approach, like, say, you want to expand more commercial area, or you want to reduce commercial area and expand more high-density, smart growth kind of operations, that would be very different from versus, like, say, the hamlet-based approach that we've been talking about, which I think is slightly different from these classical models. So I think these kind of, you can measure the capacity under these different models of zoning, and then see that what trajectory you want to take to get to that capacity, and then sustain it in terms of that, align it with the infrastructure and sustainability. That's just so capacity is a missing variable at this point of time in terms of under different forms of zoning.
Just to maybe tie that into a little bit of a bow, I mentioned earlier, there was a build-out study that was done looking at the old zoning, and that build-out study, which is essentially looking at the capacity, how many houses could be built under the zoning, given some recognition of the physical features of Shelburne, and that number was about 1,800 units. It's a pretty decent number, but it hasn't been updated in a long time. So if you're trying to get a sense of what's some people talk big thing about carrying capacity decades ago. Yeah. Well, in a sense, the carrying capacity, given the zoning from 10 years ago, was about 1,800 additional units. So, I mean, if Perry's idea is that, hey, Shelburne's good where it's at, we don't really need to grow, then something would need to change. You would need to have policies that effectively rezoned to bring that number down. Now, if what's more of concern is the stuff that you start to get at with the future land use section, and it's where you grow, and you will take more numbers as long as they're not encroaching outside the sewer service area. Well, there were some analyses, some scenarios done as part of this build-out tool. We can get the same number of people in Shelburne with very little land if we focus them on the Route 7 corridor. If the idea is, okay, so let's say we have to grow to, I forget what the target number was, 9,000 people. You can do that if you want your policies to limit the land use impact. You can focus them in the Route 7 corridor. I mean, you could do that, but you put other areas off limits. But the trend, the way things are going now, if you don't change people's land use or property rights, it's going to continue to spread around. And that's what sounds like it's not what you want. So you can bring the number down by saying less growth total, or you can bring the number down, or maybe leave it where it is, but put the areas outside off limits. And people in the past, in Shelburne, there have been these intense discussions about that, change the zoning from 5 acres to 10 acres, or 20 acres, or, I mean, how else would you think about making the rural parts of town off limits?
That was gonna be my question, like, what are the tools we have other than lot size increase to make large chunks of the rural area off limits?
When I started a long time ago, 12 years ago, that I came for about a year before I got on this commission and attended, they were doing a town plan. And they were doing that very thing, and this discussion about going to 10 acres was talked about, but they realized they couldn't, it would be very hard to get people to give up. Back then, they weren't talking about transferring development rights or anything.
You talked
It
about
was just
transfer
straight
development
zoning.
rights, talked about rezoning from 5 to 10. They talked about the developable area, which was kind of a different way to reduce the development potential.
And that was the direction they went, is by putting in the 15% slopes and non-developable land
Yeah.
and increasing or decreasing the zoning in the village.
But
So
aren't-
we've gotten to, that's how we got to where we are.
Right, so it didn't slow it enough, didn't,
I think it did work because it
I mean,
did,
it worked, but not to the extent that if we keep going on that same trajectory, we don't want to keep going on the trajectory we're on. So it bent the curve a little bit, but we need to come up with another set of tools to bend the curve further.
It's kind of like magnets, you know, you can put a magnet in the attraction part and the repel part, and the attraction part in the village worked somewhat, but the repel growth in the outside area, that wasn't really strong enough.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Because you
saying.
can continue
Yeah,
to
you
see.
need to bend that curve
it
harder.
was what they felt they could do without getting a whole lot of pushback.
Right.
at the
But,
time.
you know, there are political challenges associated with, you know, reducing development potential. I think that's what Dick is getting at.
Yeah.
Or they're very, very costly. If you are going to, you know, if Shelburne wants to be really serious about it, then it's gonna somehow take some of those parcels off the market.
Well, and that's where the hamlet it came in as an idea, that partly out of recognition that there are a number of people who come here because they would like to live in a more rural setting. So how can we support that without, you know, make this a win-win, basically? So that was the idea of, you know, the hamlet. So you would live maybe in closer immediate community and proximity, and this would happen in a way that hopefully people would see as beneficial and advantageous. And we would be able to retain as much of, or much more of our rural and pastoral character and scenery.
It's just very prescribed, right? We're telling people this is the only, you know.
Right. So it's a different, you know, I mean, we're not making any more land, you know, we have to make some choices. So this is the choice that we were putting out there as, well, let's see what happens, because the alternative is we have 5-acre zoning right now, and we kind of have a big bullseye on us, you know? I mean, the demand hasn't really materialized, but, you know, there are indications that it's, you know, it's gonna come.
Right.
And when you have, you know, that kind of development happening, I mean, there's only so much of it that, you know, you can absorb sort of elegantly before there's a tipping point, and then it's just the burbs, you know, it's South Burlington. It's all the things that people
Yeah.
say they don't want. So that's why it just seems like we have to kind of take action. And if people don't want to upzone, I think, that's the terminology, right? Upzone, when you increase the.
Add development potential. right?
Decrease development potential.
Oh, that would be down zone.
Down zone, okay, I always get the mix up. If we don't want to, you know, go to something like 10 or more, I would be in favor of more, frankly, to really have a very clear delineation between where the built is and where the natural is, but that's my aesthetic, then it seems like this is the only other way that I can think of to do it, you know, that.
Right.
maybe
Well, I mean, I think
it's-
it's
yeah.
potentially a combination of that, saying you could have areas where you are down zoning and areas where you are not, because we're saying those are areas targeted
So I
for
think-
hamlets.
I
I mean, that
think-
gets pretty prescriptive in terms of,
It does, and I think to the degree to which this can be vision-based, so there's, and this would be a vision that I would imagine the entire community participating in articulating and developing, I think we might have a chance of getting some buy-in. If people see that it's a really big picture, and we're creating a community, future community potential environment that it works for all of us, then you might get, some buy-in
Yeah.
where people would see, the advantages of conserving or volunteer, I don't know, I don't know where this would go. But I'm just trying to, I'm aware that, there are people's property rights and politics and lots of things that are beyond the control of this board
Yeah.
in the mix. And
What was the what was the, for Dick being having lived through it all, the biggest pushback were individual property owners saying you're taking away my rights, or what was the?
When we,
Yeah,
they
why
were
did,
trying.
yeah, why did they not
Well,
go?
they didn't even really present it because they knew, they knew what would happen if they tried to do, they would have everyone in the rural area would come out, because they would have been losing
Because without context,
potential development.
it comes across as, it sounds to people like a taking,
Yeah.
But if you can portray it in this, as this part of this larger goal, like we're looking at, where we're gonna be 50 years from now, people might say, oh, I think that actually makes some sense, and I might be in favor of doing this, and et cetera, and we can start to have a meaningful discussion. So one of the things that we had talked about when Jamie was still here was, there was, I ran across a community that sort of asked some of these questions of itself, and they portrayed it spatially, and they had, where do you want to be in 50 years? And, there were like 3 options, and it was like a visual preference thing, and people could vote. And one was, super, super dense, one was kind of sprawly, and one was, a kind of more, looked like a more appealing sort of mix of the two, where the growth was concentrated in certain areas and certain areas remained open. And that's the one that people picked. And so that was like their foundation for starting to talk about some of this and getting
Right.
buy-in from the community.
I like that idea.
I think just flipping through this, it struck me as interesting, unless I missed it. In the growth and development section, we're talking a lot about numbers and that sort of thing, but we're not alluding to, we'd like growth to go into the growth area and all of the other initiatives that we're working on that we want to grow intelligently. Should this section have, and I think, Perry, this was your initial question, should this section have less of a focus on numbers and metrics and that sort of thing, and more of a focus on supporting the work that we're doing towards smart growth through form-based zoning in the Route 7 corridor and what we're looking into doing with rural hamlets and that sort of thing? So that, because it isn't the point of the plan to provide the guidance so that when decisions are being made, this is what provides that spirit through which those decisions need to be made?
It's a policy tool. What's a policy? It helps people make decisions. From where I'm sitting, the thing that's registering with me is that you're having a discussion about a section that does have these numbers, and you've lost sight of the fact that there was this other discussion having to do with the where and the how. And maybe that didn't conclude as clearly as it needed to. And I know that Kate and I had some conversations, and made some crazy graphics and was saying to Kate, maybe map out an alternative so that people could agree, this is how we want to grow. Because that's what the future land use map is supposed to be. It answers the question, how do we want to grow and where do we want to grow? Shelburne just has this tradition of having a chapter called Growth and Development where it answers the question, well, how many people would that be? At least in some fashion. It's saying, the town is taking a stab at saying how many people that would be. Even if it's not related that closely to the future land use plan, it's saying how many people or how many jobs or how many households. You may not want that in your plan now if the need is all about the pattern of growth. It will be an unanswered question, basically. Someone else will have the job of saying, well, if we're going to grow in this alternative structure, we can't at this time tell you how many people or how many households that might be, but we know it's going to be different from what is allowed presently. But this conversation about this section is predicated on doing what you've done in the plan in the past. Maybe you don't need to, maybe you don't want to.
And that's why I just had a couple cosmetic changes through this and just had that one question of this number being here, tying it into the housing number, if that just passed the smell test for people. That's why I just made a couple cosmetic changes, because it was just much more like, these are more factual type things. And from what Dean had said before, the last time it went through to the select board, they changed all of it. And so that's why I had a couple cosmetic changes, and I just brought attention to that one number to say, do people think that that would be something that residents of the town would want, 25 to 50 new units on average per year?
And
So-
it does say that the growth, this quote-unquote growth rate should not be taken as a goal to be achieved on an annual
Exactly,
basis.
it's
So
very,
those caveats are there.
it's very broad, and I know we went on a very long discussion around it. So,
Well, it's a good discussion, I think, and well, thanks to Kate and Dean, I think, for grounding that the land use portion does talk about how we want growth to happen. So if I was getting too hung up on that, that will have already been laid out in the plan. So this is more just supporting that.
So do we want to make this more, a little bit more tied to infrastructure capacity? Like, kind of like get some information from Chris and talk about how we want to do that? Because I think it could be really appropriate to bring into this, the sustainability part, that we don't want to grow in a way that creates all these additional impacts. And
well, that's kind of on point 3 on the objectives. And then I think Dick may have added or negatively impact existing neighborhoods. So it's on page 40.3. But basically just saying, like, we provide what we need to provide, and we make sure that it doesn't have deleterious effects on existing households. Right there.
Oh, yeah, I think we should get specifically in there, creating stormwater runoffs, though, because, that's such a significant monetary unknown, what our ultimate liabilities and, well, I think we know what our liabilities are with some clarity, but, how we're going to be expected to address that burden, some of that is still being determined. Yeah, so anyway, I think that maybe we could, I'm just thinking about what could we do with this section to make it a bit, give it a bit more tooth, and maybe that would be to just look at it through the lens of infrastructure and capacity and our stormwater liabilities, because am I correct in understanding that we are working on an ordinance that's going to have billing and utility?
Yeah, there's a committee that's
Yeah,
working
okay,
on
yeah. So
stormwater
that could
utility.
be a good place for some of that sort of thinking.
That money is in the budget already. The town has it as a budget item this year, but it's not being built. It's been set back a year to allow the ordinance to be meaningful.
Yeah, and polished up and all that. But we could at least, it seems to me appropriate for that work and intention to be made clear and manifested in the town plan.
Andrew mentioned that should there be some sort of number, and I think there should be, to allow the town to phase in the event it wants to. So that would give it a little bit of.
Would 110 be, is, that number, I guess, was picked with a combination of projections and what our infrastructure could handle if it needed to? Is that?
No, I think
where
that number was just
Based on the
picked.
county.
It was,
Well, at the time, we had just come out of the sewer expansions, so I don't think that the constraints of facilities were holding up that number, that they were holding it back. So I
Okay.
think it was a projection that did not get constrained by facilities.
Okay.
But what you're saying is,
Well, should we
You
have
should.
should we have a new number that reflects
Like your
what we
52.
can realistically
60 or-
provide and,
Right.
Well,
Yeah, and I think we circled back to the fact that it's at least half of that at most.
yeah, no more than half.
Well, that's what the CCRPC is expecting, right?
Right.
But does that align with what our infrastructure can
Well, some of it's
handle?
an issue of what time period are we talking about? You know, we're not gonna outrun our water supply, putting aside the storage issue. Wastewater does have capacity, I think it's fair to say, at least for 5 years. We're going to have a new library, and I would imagine the capacity of the library is not gonna be exceeded. I'll pull out the school projections, I don't think that the school capacity is gonna be exceeded in 5 years. So some of it depends on how long a time frame are we talking about.
Okay.
And Perry, if it's around 50 persons, that's just a quarter of that in units? I mean, is it basically a 1 to 4?
Well, depends on how many kids you have.
No, I know, but
Yeah, oh,
the
yeah.
math seems to be about
Yeah.
a 4 to 1 ratio. Just curious.
The time frame would be when you would arrive at that capacity. So if the 1800 is the maximum capacity that's left, if you add 100 per year, you
Yeah.
have 18 years to think about. I mean, that's how I would calculate that.
Yeah, I mean, when the town went through the process for planning the wastewater facilities, it designed the facilities with an expected life of 20 years, and our rate of growth has been so slow that the capacity could last 25
Yeah.
or more years.
Absolutely.
Unless
So-
EPA does something surprising, like requiring higher,
This CPA?
no, this is not gonna happen now,
Yeah, I don't think so.
but it might have happened a
We're
couple years
safe till
ago.
at least 2020.
Yeah.
Talk was at one point.
Well, I mean, just a quick aside, plans have to be updated. It'll be every 8 years now. Some people look at that as, that's how far ahead you look. But projections go many, many years past that. And this group, I don't believe, has had a specific conversation about, well, what's the target date? You know, what's the end goal period? Is it just 5 or 8 or 10 years, or is it you're looking 20 or 30? Because it's gonna take a long time to bend that curve. What suits people?
Definitely did reference, Shelburne 2050 in this section a couple different times. Um,
And just the math that you did on the numbers that we have from the county, it roughs out to about 50-something through 2025
they went
anyway,
out
and
to
it drops a little after that. So I think if we needed to pick a number, and we've got the caveats that it's not a goal to be achieved on an annual basis, I mean, would we be okay putting in a number like 50 and just say that that's based on
45,
current projections in
40.
February of 2018?
Can we get a 40? 45?
I'd be happy with that. I mean, based on those numbers, sure.
Well, because I think some of those numbers anticipated 100 when the reality was 20. So if they're off by a factor of 5, is the
Significantly, I don't think they've ever been accurate.
right,
Anywhere.
is a projection of 50 just shooting crazy high too?
Probably shouldn't go further out than
I mean, like,
2020, or 2020, I wouldn't think.
It's predicated on things that are so far outside their own, like. If the state came out tomorrow and said, we're getting rid of all Vermont state income tax, and we're not having businesses that come to the state pay any tax for 10 years, right? You're gonna have a lot more businesses, which means you're gonna have more people, which means they're gonna need housing, and then there would be our demand.
Right.
And that goes into our growth patterns based on land use and everything else.
Exactly.
It's a number
So, whatever.
that can help us.
But I don't think
basing
the
it.
state forecast that
50,
this is based on
55,
says
60. I think it is just a number. Let's just pick one.
And then the other thing that I brought up is, we say about forest products. Where?
I saw that. We do actually, though, we have some timber.
That was my question on economic development, point 4 on page 42.
And sugaring,
Encourage appropriately scaled value-added agriculture and forest product enterprises. I didn't know if we wanted to encourage forest product enterprises.
I mean, it depends if maple syrup's considered a forest product.
Forest product I take is like logging and timber and.
No, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some discussion around that on the Energy Committee as part of that things can be done sustainably. I mean, if there are opportunities to do that and that provides wood for biomass heating and that sort of thing, then as long as it's done in a sustainable way.
But that's not our strong suit. I mean, we're
Right,
not gonna
yeah,
be
it wouldn't.
leading the county in any kind of.
In
form.
timberland
No.
production, no, I
Right,
just
no,
thought
not
it
at
was
all.
interesting that it was,
I
One
think,
of the things that some towns use
Current
that
use.
for is to not allow forests to be cut for solar applications. Forest and farmland, there's some folks that are fighting, the proliferation of solar panels on agricultural land.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's also like, I walk in these trails off Webster Road, so David Webster's closed them because he's doing some forestry stuff, right? He's logging it to bring the health of his forest back.
Yeah.
So that's the type of stuff I think you do want to encourage
yeah.
from a wildlife corridor and ecosystem standpoint.
And that is in the growth area.
but the scale at which stuff happens, I mean,
That's
You know-
tiny, yeah,
yeah,
It
it's,
says appropriately.
and we're not gonna
scaled.
support a sawmill in Shelburne.
right.
So, other than that, I
You could
just.
probably cut that whole thing right out and no one would notice, you know what I
Right,
mean?
Uh,
Like,
th-
I don't-
that's why I
don't-
just,
yeah.
I brought it to the attention, but so anyway, going back to this number, given that we have all of the other components of the plan and the land use and all of that, we wanna have a number here because we need a number. Does it seem like slicing that by 60% or a little more than?
I think I would have two numbers. I think if I were in charge, one would be since the last plan, the historic average growth has been X, and we project going forward it will be Y. Right? We know what it's been over the last, 5 to 7 years. So, I mean, that just grounds it in reality.
Once we get the census.
Yeah, we have the American Community Survey, which is an estimate, and it's over 3
Yeah,
years.
it's aren't good either.
And they're not great.
May not be a census.
And this 2020 census probably isn't happening,
But
so.
as long as we can take these tables and say, based on this table, if you take out the outliers, I'm roughing that's probably going to be somewhere in the 40s. So, I mean, even if we just said 50 as a number, that it's there, because this is still.
They're saying 58 for this time period. And
Let's take the median.
that's probably a good number.
Yeah, like whatever we come up with, it's not set in stone. We still have some time, and if new data comes out, we can do that.
We don't know our historical growth over the last couple of years outside of a census, like the
Health Department does census estimates, or they have done them, they lag, so they don't get them out within like 2 or 3 years. So there are numbers, but
right. I'm just thinking even in town hall, like here, like.
we don't have our own census. I mean, we don't prepare our own estimate of the population. It's just too.
Being mindful of time, is this enough just to incorporate these ideas? It doesn't look like it would be a ton, but with a focus on making sure growth is done sustainably with an understanding of our infrastructure capacity.
And
Do you feel that that's not already here? Like, that's why the changes I made were more cosmetic, that it was about,
Yeah, I suppose it does. And
I know Kate brought this point up before, is that it's so broad and all-encompassing that it doesn't really say much of anything, but
like the three goals don't specifically, I mean, they talk about the last one as a do it in a cost-effective manner consistent with the planned rates of population, housing, and economic growth. So I suppose it does have that.
because the first one's about managing growth. The second one is encouraging that growth that keeps things in line with the character of the community. And then the third part is to do it in such a way that it's responsibly done with all of the resources that the town has.
I think just in the last one, based on the conversation that Kate really gave this, I think, really good suggestion about kind of like having some vision and comparing the business as usual form-based scenario versus the kind of like hamlet-based or some alternative scenario where Shelburne does not end up like South Burlington, and rather certain character is maintained and also certain ecosystem services and other kind of like ecological conservation issues are managed.
Does Kate, are you saying, give Kate a crack at editing and adding that paragraph between the first two
I
paragraphs?
think like at least proposing some action item that if, at some point of time, if you can have like some public opinion or participation in terms of comparing the business as usual trajectory of like, say, this is where we are going, and if you continue with that versus like, say, having a vision which is alternative vision, but then when you let people compare not just the economic and the number of people, but also the infrastructure capacity issues, as well as kind of like ecosystem services or other kinds of water quality issues, like what are the trade-offs there, and let people vote.
It just integrates the parts of the plan a little better.
Energy issues. So from that perspective, I think
Yeah.
opening that gate, like in terms of like just as a recommendation to kind of have that process unfold with public participation, where you can compare where we are headed in the long run versus where we want to be. I think that could be just a way to kind of like maybe derive some meaningful action from this conversation that we had, which I thought was very meaningful.
So what I would say is if you want to propose a recommended action, if you're talking about something that's going to happen in the future and not part of the adoption process for this document, but
Yeah.
it's something that should happen in the future, take a crack at editing one of the recommended actions.
Yeah, I mean, I
Add-
think it's the last one where we talk about the future, right? I mean, that's with
Okay.
balancing these different goals and,
But you do have the edit privileges, right?
Yeah.
You got it, okay.
yeah. I mean, I was just saying, like, how do people feel about it? Like, is this something?
I think we're all, I think that there's a lot more alignment than not alignment. So, yeah, I mean, any comments to start tying things together, I'm, no objection.
Something about growth rates supporting sustainability of the town.
I think ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve. Sustainability and not growing beyond our means.
I like the thing that keeps bouncing around my head is the idea that Kate threw out of kind of being able to throw 3 different pictures of what Shelburne could look like,
Yeah.
and just saying what do people want. I don't know the mechanism of how
There are
you
some
get-
surveys available too. Are they still available?
Well,
I've had some previous surveys, and everyone has supported the rural district pretty strongly. It's always been a strong point of any of the surveys we've done. I think we've done 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think it just to tie it in because we're trying to move it beyond sort of an abstraction of, yeah, everybody loves the rural areas and thinks they should stay. Well, if we have 5-acre zoning and there's development pressure, that might not be, sort
But
of,
even
it might not be sufficient.
even a 5-acre zone, if they did develop it, the DRB still can require clustering. I mean, it's in a district that,
Well, can't require clustering unless it's a 6-unit subdivision. So in
right,
the
so any
rural
larger
district.
scale
So,
project.
I mean, that's one of the changes in policy that maybe would be made to the zoning regs, but they can't require clustering unless it's a big enough project.
They're all PUDs if they're over a certain amount, right?
Right, the number has to be that, but you just said that they could require clustering. Well, they can require clustering if it's a big enough project.
Right.
So-
And we have talked about reducing that too, but.
Right.
So anyway, there's a lot of sort of loopholes that, trucks can be driven through, basically. So, yeah, so anyway, that's one thing I've seen that just presents the issue and the potential solution very clearly, in a way that many people can grasp, and it's kind of appealing, and you just vote on it, and then you can start.
So, but I guess, again, are we saying that we want to set up a visual preference survey. I mean, we've done them
Are you- is that
before
what
for
you're
the
thinking, Andrew?
projects.
And then just incorporate that into the town plan, like this is what people said they
Well, I
wanted?
guess one of the things I worry about is, we're sitting here, I don't know how many people actually watch this, but like, sometimes I feel like
It's
we're.
like up there with the Grammys, I'm
Yeah,
telling you.
we're just sitting in a little vacuum and thinking about all the things we want, but there's a lot of voices that are not represented in this room. People come to the room if they have a specific thing they're worried
Yeah.
about, but, how many people are really thinking about it? And so just getting a broader cross-section of feedback would be interesting to me.
Yeah.
I mean, politics in town are complicated right now. There's very different visions about things like the salt shed and other things, so trying to do some things that would build a consensus in town and get everybody unified would be interesting.
What did we get back last time, was it?
What did you do what?
What did we get back percentage-wise?
Then the percent, well,
Is it-
so we've gotten over 500 responses for the last 2 surveys, but they included a combination of online and paper. We've done a smaller scale, call it visual preference survey, as part of a specific study, and I think that had about 85 or so, but that was online only, and it was part of a frankly somewhat complicated survey. But I just would want to know that if you want to do it, then the key thing is going to be what are the images that you're going to ask people, and visual preference surveys are typically done with images of types of development, less so with the pattern of development, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what will essentially be conceptual land use maps. So who's going to do them? What are they going to show? So on.
It's going to be a lot of work.
Well, it doesn't, I mean, if someone said, oh, I've got these 3 examples, I know exactly what, they don't necessarily have to show Shelburne. I think it's more helpful if they showed Shelburne, but they could be
I think it's actually,
examples.
I think it would actually be better conceptually if they didn't, because then it keeps it sort of abstract, which is important, because I don't think anybody would appreciate us making some sort of speculation about what,
Their
their
property.
property might look like. I don't want to get somebody hung up on that. So I think maybe there are maybe some examples, and I'd be happy to look around for them from, places that are similar to us that would be representative. We could consider it and see what we think,
Yeah.
and if this would be something that seems like it would be compelling, to put out there to
Yeah.
the
I mean,
to
Heinsberg,
residents.
as part of their plan update, did a series of like mini surveys. And they didn't get huge responses, but they had specific questions. They put them out there and they got responses, and it gave them some guidance, and the commission can certainly do that. For this one, I think for it to be useful, though, you have to have some idea of what you want those graphics to show. The abstraction is going to be helpful. It's just that you're going to then have to translate that abstraction into Shelburne when you actually want to make it part of a land use map or of a map.
Right.
But that's not a problem. If someone gave me 3 graphics, then we could have it online in a day.
Oh, for an online survey? sort of thing?
Well, we did it last time, just incorporating it into a Google survey with a bunch of images.
So do you do that with, do you track unique entries by IP address, or somebody puts in their address? or something?
In terms of, we haven't, there is a way Google can allow someone to do it, and they can go back and revisit, but, if you clear out your cookies, or you can game it, most people won't do that. I don't think you need to worry too much about it. I think that if you have some repeat responses, then that's a small price to play if you can get a survey up in a day and you have 100 people respond to it, because you get some feedback that you didn't have before.
If you could somehow stick it on Front Porch Forum, probably get
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
a pretty high result.
How have you typically distributed that to people saying, hey, we want your feedback?
When it was the online only?
Yeah.
It was part of a study that had some meetings, and so the URL was announced as part of the meetings. We did press releases, I think it was mentioned. It's going back probably about 5 years ago. Front Porch Forum.
So,
So-
Shelburne News, Front Porch
Shelburne,
Forum, all
yeah,
those
the
sort of
usual
things.
suspects.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that'd be great. Definitely give us the temperature of those who respond anyway.
Yeah, you know, if they do it on Front Porch Forum, they have a computer.
You can invite people and have them engage
Library
in that
access.
discussion. So I
And
wrote a sentence.
we had
which-
just to type, our grant application, which I thought was going to be a winner with a survey and focus groups, would have been funded, and we didn't get funded, but I mean, that goes back to October.
I see, yeah.
But a focus group is a good idea as well. That takes more effort to structure.
You know, I'm kind of changing my tune. I'm thinking maybe it does make sense to use the town itself. And one of the things we do know is that we do know what the zoning allows for each area. We could just use under present zoning, this kind of a build-out. This would be the conventional, like the default, very suburban looking. And
Yeah,
then
well,
there
we
could
have
be
the zoning,
something-
we don't have a build-out map. I mean, we have numbers, we have a
Don't we have,
crude map.
don't we
a
have
crude map.
the software that does a kind of,
Well, it's a crude, it's not gonna be necessarily visually appealing, so when you say if we have a map already showing the build-out under existing zoning, we have, but it's gonna probably get enough questions in people's minds where we'll have to be careful, we'll have to edit to make something where they can look at it and comprehend, okay, I see what's going on. I mean, a lot of build-out maps in the old days were measle maps, you saw all these red dots, and you could compare a map of one set of red dots with another set of red dots, and that conveyed something.
okay.
I mean-
Well, I guess graphically, I could kind of mess around and just, try and come up with something. It's just to show the concept of, do you want, how do you want the development to be concentrated in the town? Do you-
Absolutely, I think that would be really great. And
Yeah.
bringing out those hamlets
Yeah.
in one of those scenarios, compare it with some kind of like a South Burlington like scenario. That's where we are headed.
Like,
With
do you like this, or do you like
right,
this?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I just
Yeah.
added on page 45, item number 13. Please feel free to edit the language. I just was thinking aloud here. But balance long-term development and growth projections with sustainability and resilience goals by comparing alternate visions of future development, conservation, and growth trajectories, and public participation through visual surveys and focus groups may be encouraged to elicit community preferences and or develop common vision or something like that. I mean, I didn't add any more, but you can flesh it out in terms of like, just.
And the only thing I was thinking about with that, up at the very beginning, that sentence, was just to say something like, Shelburne wishes to retain its rural character in areas not designated for growth.
Yeah. I was getting to that part through the conservation language, but I think that can be explicitly stated.
And that's just kind of like speaking to rural character. And then I think within the growth areas, we want the growth to happen in ways that are, resilient, help build community as opposed to work against it. So, that gets into our path system and connecting neighborhoods and encouraging more multimodality so that, all the great walking that David Webster allows you guys to do now, that could, if that develops, that could be sort of baked into whatever the new neighborhoods that emerge from that. That would still be something that would be a feature.
But you're not saying to add the stuff about resiliency at this point.
No, I maybe not. I mean, I think we're going to discuss it in other areas, but I'm just thinking about how all this ties together. Because 110 new persons a year in the rural area would be a disaster, to my mind. But if they are on Route 7, it's great, actually. So it's all
Yeah.
place matters. Location and place matter.
Yeah, and this, again, this just answers the question of the total.
Yeah.
Do we want to continue with some comments and revisit this next time?
Sure.
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't I see if I can kind of mess around with this idea and just develop it a
That
little
would be
bit?
great.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and the visual survey too, I think is a great idea. And the more input we can get from the town, the better
Yeah.
off we'll be.
I mean, I'm just thinking if we could actually do a little quick survey and the results of that could go into this, that would be so meaningful for so much of the work that we're doing.
So yes, this is due to come back the next meeting, and also housing and transportation is supposed to come back, but that could be pushed back a little bit, given that it was really looked at as the second meeting in March.
Right. Okay, should we do that? And since housing was going to be part of that as well,
The agenda,
Should
it was
given
really
the
just,
time?
if there was something burning that came up having to do with housing, because it was prompted by the growth discussion. Nothing mandated to deal with tonight, but
okay, so we can save our comments on housing for,
if there's nothing burning.
yeah,
Works for me.
all right. Well, given the time, should we move on to any updates?
I had mentioned in the memo that I sent to you, having a couple of things to talk about. One of them was form-based zoning. Did I include in your packets? Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. In your packets, there was a simple version of the checklist for form-based zoning. That project has been essentially closed out at the RPC. I think I gave you a simplified version of the punch list, but I guess I just want to keep mentioning form-based zoning because it was such a big project, and if people have questions, it's a lot of information to try to absorb, and at some point, I'm expecting you'll want to move it forward. But anyway, I won't say anything more. If people have questions about the checklist or the punch list, let me know. The other item that had not been addressed, actually, before we leave form-based zoning, one of the things that was prepared as part of the project were some kind of promotional materials. And I haven't gotten these on the website yet, but they're going on the website. If people have other ideas about the distribution, but they answer the question, what is the form-based zoning, simple stuff like that. As part of her work, Brandy did do these 3 handouts, and like I say, they will go on the website. The third one was how will form-based zoning create a sense of place. So if you had not seen those before, they are on the link.
And the mechanism for that is, we would need to, historically speaking, that would be a big chunk of a meeting to go through those updates, gain consensus, and then warn a hearing to adopt them?
The form-based zoning is such a big piece of work. I think some of it depends on people's stomach. You really should understand it. Some of you are new, and yeah, it's going to take some time.
Well, and the reason I asked that is because we had that scheduled out to make sure that we get to the town plan, because I
Yeah.
feel that we're behind where we want to be on that. But, so how would we balance that? I mean, I get that there's been a ton of work poured into form-based zoning, and I'd prefer to have that out there as soon as possible.
So one of the things I wasn't sure about, Dean, was how satisfied you were with the changes that were made.
My take on this is that it's an improvement over the current document. And I have, yeah, it's an improvement. So my recommendation would be to move it forward, because I think it provides a lot of benefits. It's not perfect. It doesn't do all the things that we had hoped it would do, but it still does a lot of work to improve the existing bylaw that was adopted hastily, I think. And so it would be good. But I don't expect any of you to vote in favor of warning a hearing on it until you understand it, because there's
Right.
just so much stuff in it. It's just
So
a-
one of the things that was critically important was the infill calculation.
Yeah, and that's in there, and I'm okay with it.
Okay.
I think it does what we need it to do, which is to answer the question, how are we gonna calculate this?
Okay, all right, that was the critical question I had, was,
Yeah, I mean, I think-
if from an administrative standpoint, it seemed to make sense to your department.
It makes enough sense to me. I think it really is a question of, does it work for the planning commission, ultimately
Right.
the select board.
Is there
Right.
a way for us to review what the changes were without having to go through the whole document?
Not easily, unfortunately. That was one of the, not easily. I mean, I can give you an email where I said, where is this? What's the difference? But
That
it's
was
not like a
actually-
red line.
That was actually very helpful because, Dean's department is the one that is ultimately administering this on a day-to-day basis. So I really took a lot of my cues from what do the people who, have to abide by this make of it, in terms of its, user-friendliness and clarity and functionality. And so I think if you do you want to take a look at it and just look at it through the lens of Dean's comments, it'll get you pretty quickly to the parts that you are interested in. One of the other things that we decided to not really develop too far yet is the stormwater regulations, which I know were really important to you. And some of that is because we're still, as you were noting, figuring out where we're going as a town with some of this stuff. So, so that it's clearer, but it's more work can be done in that area. One of the things I'm concerned about is, I think retail is changing. The original plan was adopted with the idea that we could look forward to getting all of this, new retail coming in, and that, just in the last couple of years, that's really not realistic anymore. So I'm going forward, I would actually be interested in how can we encourage even more housing? Because I think that's really going to be something that has the greatest potential. And then the big thing is, how do we get this to become the de facto zoning? Because I think the fact that it's an option is its biggest, it's the biggest detriment to using it.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had a huge level of interest. If it was mandatory, of course, everybody would be using it. But if everyone was using it, I think we would be finding even more flaws. We have caught a lot of the flaws that were incorporated in the version that was passed, but we're gonna find more. I still would like to see us have several projects under our belt before it's made mandatory.
Would you? Okay.
But I don't think that, well, I would be interested to know if the select board would consider it, given how limited the use has been. Somebody want to talk to them about that? But the other issue, and being mindful of the time, it has to do with the neighborhood development areas, and we've talked about those. And what I wanted to just say about that is that one of the issues about that designation had to do with the Shelburne Wood Mobile Home Park, because they might benefit from that designation. And there's a select board meeting next Tuesday. There's a presentation to the select board. It's kind of an initial discussion about the future of the mobile home park and the land beyond where the mobile homes are located now. Long story short, as that gels, then it could become the focus of a neighborhood development area designation. It's just that's where the attention will be focused, and I just wanted people to know that it is moving forward slowly, and if you really are interested, then pay attention to the select board meeting Tuesday night.
Those are the updates.
Sorry?
Those are the updates.
That's what I had.
Awesome. The next one, commissioner questions and comments. No question. The only comment I had was the, what you had sent out, and I'm gonna blank on the overall name, but, I think it's in March. There was something pertaining to the energy section. There was a particular workshop. But that's
Yes.
part of a greater thing, that
Right.
it's a legislative update to towns.
Yeah, Melanie had, yeah.
I wasn't sure if that's something that anybody would be, I think you just sent that to the energy committee,
I think I
right?
did just send it to
That-
you, yes, to you and the
Yeah.
energy folks.
I don't know if anybody's interested in day-long workshops on the legislative process as it pertains to town activities. But we could forward that email if anybody is.
I'm all excited.
I can tell. Any other business or correspondence? If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. Moved by Andrew, seconded by Dick. Meeting adjourned. All in favor?
Aye.
Snuck it in.